Welcome to Positive Disintegration, a path to authenticity. Today, a special episode. This is a recording of the presentation which Chris and I gave at Gift-a-Palooza in February 2024. Special thanks to Mike and Julie Postma for not only hosting Gift-a-Palooza and inviting us to present, but also for sharing the recording with us so that we can share it with you. Chris and I will give an overview of positive disintegration and how it works. We'll talk about its applicability to the gifted, and we'll also share our timelines, our personal stories of disintegration through our lives, and what finding the theory has meant to us.
Welcome to everyone who's with us. It's great to be here with you today for Gift-a-Palooza, and I'm so excited to present with Emma for the first time. You know, we've done more than 50 podcast episodes together, but this is our first time presenting. It's very exciting.
It is very exciting.
It is. So much so that, my heart is elevated. I'm feeling my overexcitabilities in action right now. So, woo. My name is Dr. Chris Wells. I'm a writer, researcher, Dąbrowski scholar. I'm a licensed social worker. My doctorate is in psychology. I'm president of the Dąbrowski Center and co-host of the Positive Disintegration podcast, as mentioned, with Emma.
Yeah, I am excited to be here too. I'm Emma Nicholson, and I'm a business analyst in Sydney by day, and by night, I guess, I am the vice president at the Dąbrowski Center, co-host of the PD podcast, and I also blog and make YouTube videos about overexcitabilities and the theory at my website, Tragic Gift.
I'm going to kick us off by talking a little bit about Kazimierz Dąbrowski and who he was. Dąbrowski was a psychiatrist and a psychologist who lived from 1902 to 1980, and his early work showed his interest in suffering. His medical thesis in 1929 was about the psychological conditions of suicide. His PhD thesis in psychology was on the psychological basis of self-mutilation. And that early work really showed how he felt that nervousness could lead to what he called positive disintegration. And what that is a breakdown of your existing psychic structure. There's two main types of disintegration. One is called Unilevel, the other is called Multilevel. They can coexist. And people who are gifted, intense, and sensitive often experience positive disintegration because they have a nervous system that is more likely to produce what he called dynamisms, which are at the heart of the process. On this slide, it really reflects the most positive potential outcome of this process. It doesn't always happen this way where it's a positive disintegration. It can also be negative, but that's kind of positive disintegration in a nutshell. If you want much more detail after today about the process, you can join us on the podcast. But you can see here in this diagram that Emma created that you start off with who you think you are, or what we've labeled here the structured self. And then through this process of loosening and fragmentation, that's the disintegration. And the processes that are part of that, like dissociation, is one kind of process that can be part of a positive disintegration. I'm not sure that it always is part of it, but it certainly was for me in my life. And when you're in the disintegration, that is really where the dynamisms come into play, which we will get into later. There's no neat way to talk about this. Whenever we try to do it, it's like, well, there's all these terms that people aren't familiar with. And so we do our best to try and just introduce them and make sense of them.
I was going to say, so this is like my little imagination working and my imagining of the process. And I guess when we're talking about disintegration, it's, as Chris said, it's that loosening of stuff. So when you think you know who you are, everything starts to fall apart. You can go through a process then of sorting things out and trying to reshape. So it's a little bit like pulling apart Lego bricks and rebuilding yourself, figuring out, what goes at the top and what goes at the bottom. And I guess that reason why that little loop is in the middle, as we'll talk about later, is disintegration's not just a linear straight through process. You don't just go step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Through your life, you will get moments where new information or circumstances will come in and it can start that cycle of development again. So anything that causes you to question yourself or rethink who you are, most of us have been through moments like that in our lives. So it describes a process of how your structures change, but I think it's important to know that it's not just a straight through, you do it once and you're at the end and you're perfect. It is really a cycle of growth.
Totally. I've been through disintegration so many times, which we'll get into a bit later. But now we are going to move to values.
So one of the things that stood out for me with the theory is that Dąbrowski, when he talks about what is disintegrating, he talks about rethinking your values and who it is you're really supposed to be, and then acting in alignment with that. So when we think about what values are, they are the principles or the standards that we have in place for ourselves that drive our behaviour, but they're based on what we see as important in life. So you can see that little diagram that I've got. So you've got everything that you believe to be true in life and what your priorities are. So that's what you see as important. And based on that, you then build out standards for yourself of how you think you should behave. And then your behaviours come out the back of that. So between those levels, there can be sort of misalignment in that. So if you aren't living life in accordance with your own values, so you're not walking your talk, you're doing maybe what society tells you to do and not what you really feel in your heart, there can be conflict and tension from that. Or you can get a misalignment at those bottom levels of what's important to you. So if you get new information which expands your horizons, or maybe you go through an experience or some sort of traumatic event, you can start to question, well, what is really important to me? You know, some people go from being very career focused and then one day something happens and they go, well, is money really that important to me? And so when those things get knocked out of alignment, everything that makes up what is arguably your identity starts to come loose. And that's really what is driving that disintegrative process.
I want to just mention that for Dąbrowski, who was from Poland, I mean, when you think about how values were so important to him and were a part of this theory, and again, he was born in 1902, so living through 2 world wars in Poland, I mean, the things that he saw and how he saw like the whole range of values in people, people who were willing to put themselves in harm's way to protect other people, compared to people who were very egocentric and only looking out for themselves. Values were a huge part of the theory, and it's so hard to capture everything that we want to say, but it just always goes back to like who he was and the time he was living in. And yet these issues are so similar now, just in different ways. These problems are just patterns that seem to repeat themselves generation after generation.
Yeah, and I think to that, Chris, too, the events that he was living through made him wonder about, well, how can some people go through this event and come out more self-aware and more empathetic and more worldly, and some people go through it and come out crueler and more hardened? So it's not just the event itself, it's how the individual responds to what's going on in their life and how they reshape themselves that's really important.
Well, now I'm going to tackle the 2 developmental processes, unilevel and multilevel, and just try and explain, again, in a nutshell, what the differences are between them. So unilevel here, I'm going to choose this photo of a swamp. There's no hierarchy of values in unilevel disintegration. The process takes place on one structural and experiential level. So a person in this kind of disintegration doesn't have a clear sense of higher and lower behavior. There's 3 dynamisms in unilevel disintegration: ambivalence, ambitendencies, and the second factor. Ambitendency is a word that's not really, I don't know if Dąbrowski coined it or what, but it means self-sabotaging behaviors, or behaviors that are at odds with each other, conflicting. And the second factor is like susceptibility to social influence, worrying what other people think about you. And these 3 dynamisms don't have the force in them to drive development. They can lead to really bad things: addiction, severe mental illness, suicide. I will give you some examples from my own life later on this. The unilevel process is automatic with only weak self-awareness. Problems and conflicts are recycled and not necessarily resolved. because there's no clear way out of them. Somatic issues can be seen in unilevel disintegration, where your conflicts become problems in your body. This could be like ulcers, migraines, and a host of other issues. So the multi-level process is very different, and it doesn't emerge naturally from the unilevel process. One important thing to understand about this theory is that it's not ontological. So it doesn't just happen the same way for everybody and unfold throughout the lifespan. Everyone's experience is different, and some people may have a unilevel disintegration that never translates into a multi-level one. Some people in childhood seem to end up in a multi-level disintegration without ever having very much of a unilevel process. And so it's extremely individual. The multi-level process, the hallmark of it is inner conflict. And so this is where values conflicts really come to the fore. And the first phase of this kind of disintegration is spontaneous, where it just emerges and you're grappling with it, and it can feel really unpleasant and difficult and painful and like you're absolutely losing your mind. It's also more conscious, and you have more of an awareness of what's happening and your conflicts compared to the unilevel process. If the first part of the disintegration is spontaneous, later it can become more organized and directed, and it contains the structures at that point and the processes to allow you to do the rebuilding and like the refashioning of yourself into an authentic personality. And so how can we tell which of these processes is active? It's in the dynamisms. So you can see there are a ton of dynamisms, but they're all important, and we did the best we could to just kind of put them out here. So you can see the three that I mentioned for unilevel, and then multi-level, there's so many, and some of them are dynamisms of valuation, like hierarchization, which is the sorting process of where is this, value in my hierarchy now? Or where is this behavior in my hierarchy? Who am I? What do I care about? This is an intellectual process. The third factor is kind of the action part of that process, where, now you're affirming the aspects of yourself that are more like you, and you're rejecting and getting rid of the parts of yourself that aren't like you, and so this is not just an intellectual activity, but something that you are emotionally discovering the hierarchy of values, and you are acting on it. You're actually living them. And so all of these multi-level dynamisms can be in precursor form before they become full dynamisms, and they can be of different strengths. Like guilt, I think, is a great example of this, where you can have kind of a lower level kind of guilt that isn't transformative, where you're like, oh, I feel bad that I did that, but not bad enough to do anything about it. Or you can have true guilt where you are moved to, make things right after you've done something wrong. And so what do you want to say about the dynamisms?
I think you're right on that. When we're talking about, that whole process of pulling your Lego bricks apart and rebuilding, I guess I see Unilevel as all your bricks are falling apart, and you're like, you know what? I have no idea where these things are supposed to go. And that's why it's Unilevel. There's no clear higher or lower. But the reason why in the picture of the swamp, I said, look, it can look like expanded horizons. It's because maybe you've got new information in that's making you question what you previously believed or what your values were before. And you just go, oh, wow, maybe I've been thinking about this wrong. But it can also look like, as Chris said, that self-sabotaging stuff and conflicting behaviors. You're like, you know what, maybe you're going to choose the wrong path, or maybe you're not going to choose anything at all and just sit and stagnate. And then that multi-level, when it's prompting you that conflict to try and rebuild. So put your Lego bricks together in a new order. And sometimes those feelings like guilt or being dissatisfied with yourself and having those negative feelings that showed you what the wrong path was that you were walking, sometimes they can urge you into doing something new and to reshape yourself, but sometimes they can also just cripple you with those emotions as well. So even when you're in multi-level sort of processes, and we'll sort of see this with our stories later, sometimes you can just sit there and do nothing about it. And I personally went through a period of negative disintegration where I just let the emotions crush me and didn't do anything. But I think that's why on the other side of the slide, we've got the tools. So these are the higher dynamisms that Dąbrowski called out that said, hey, there's actually things you can do in these situations, stuff that you can apply consciously that will help you sort through this stuff, that will help you figure out what are your true values, what's more like you, and then figure out how to walk that talk.
Yeah, well said. Now we're going to connect the dynamisms with the overexcitabilities, because this is really the raw material in a person that can produce the dynamisms. We're not going to go into them in depth today. If you want to know more about overexcitabilities, you can listen to the podcast. We have multiple episodes that go into them. This book on the slide, Mellow Out by Michael Piechowski, is really my favorite place to read about them in a book. Emma has videos about overexcitability, so there's plenty of places if you're unfamiliar with them. But we feel like this is usually something that most people already know about. So there's 5 types, and the emotional overexcitability that's what brings the emotionally charged dynamisms of spontaneous multi-level disintegration, dissatisfaction with yourself, disquietude with yourself, inferiority toward yourself. All of these dynamisms have an emotional basis to them. And the ones that are more cognitive, kind of the tools that were on the right side of the previous slide, are more intellectual. And this is why the theory is so applicable to the gifted, because while not all gifted people have these 5 overexcitabilities, they're quite common in the gifted population. And if you have multiple strong overexcitabilities, you have a more intense experience of reality if you also have these advanced cognitive abilities. And so it's common for gifted people to be kind of harsh and overly self-critical. And there's a direct connection there with the multi-level dynamisms. Did you want to say anything about overexcitability?
I suppose I should, considering I based a whole YouTube channel around it, right? I think this intense experience of the world, I always say it's like, everybody's playing their guitar, right? But when I'm playing my guitar with overexcitabilities, I've got my amplifier turned all the way up to volume 11. When life is very rich and very loud and more complex and more multifaceted, which, as a gifted community, I think a lot of us can relate to, you see life in a different way. Whether or not it's you're looking at what you've been taught is, right and wrong and the way the world should be, and you can see it differently, and you think that maybe that's not the path for you, or you're experiencing emotionally very, very strong dynamisms that are really driving you to change that behavior, or intellectually and imaginationally, you're thinking, hey, you know what? I could be a better person. Maybe there's a better path out of this. Maybe you're dreaming of, a better reality for yourself. We can see how that sort of leads us into that path of prompting us to follow that developmental process. Whether or not we're successful at actually navigating that on our own is a completely different thing. But I think Michelle Kane put it the best way when she said, some people, they get the standard 8-pack of crayons and they're just colouring with one colour at a time. But some of us have got the entire Crayola 64 box with the sharpener included, and we're often got 8 crayons at the same time in life and colouring away. And I think that stronger, more richer experience of, everything that we get in and everything that we experience in our own minds will actually prompt us to self-reflect and to look at ourselves. And it's basically trying to tell us to follow that path. And I think this is really why this tool can be so powerful for the gifted community, because whether or not we know how to navigate our way out of it, we're probably feeling the thing. And we'll talk about our experiences later. If you don't know about the framework, it doesn't mean you're not going to feel crushing guilt. It doesn't mean that you're not going to question the way the world works. So I think this is why it's important for us to bring this theory to this community, because we can get lost in the swamp. We can hide in a cave on that mountainside because a lot of us experience these overexcitabilities and it's trying to tell us something to move forward. But sometimes we just don't have the compass or the equipment to navigate our way out.
Now that we've talked a little bit about what disintegration is, we're going to shift into how to move through it and get through it, walking your talk.
This is the compass.
This is the compass. That's right. So the type of disintegration process that you're in dictates how you're going to move through it. Unilevel disintegration, by virtue of the fact that it isn't really conscious and in your awareness, means that it's more difficult to navigate in many ways because of that lack of self-awareness. The lack of a hierarchy of values means that you don't have a clear path or a direction forward. And so folks who are going through unilevel disintegration, I think especially need an experienced guide to help them gain awareness, to help activate potentially multi-level dynamisms in them, which could already be present, like I said, in kind of a precursor or incipient form. And so, yeah, I mean, unilevel disintegration is tough because it often presents somatically. My mind is blowing up a little because, there's so much to say about the experience of dynamisms and how when you're in a unilevel disintegration, it can just feel like you're in the fog, or like you're treading water, or, there's so many different metaphors of how it could feel. But, finding a direction forward, there's so much that keeps us from moving in the direction that we need to go. I'm just going to go into multi-level now. And again, another part of the problem is that because the unilevel process doesn't naturally become a multi-level process, it's hard to say when or if that's going to happen. It's up to you to create that vertical shift. And as I said, it can be something that comes to you emotionally. Something can happen to you. There's so many different ways this can look. Some people experience traumas. And when I talk a bit about my story, I'll say that, that was a huge part of my own history, is many different kinds of traumatic experiences. But you don't have to be traumatized to go through a disintegration. And we actually did a quick bite episode about this. There's other ways that disintegration can happen. Sometimes it's just a shock. Michael did a paper called Rethinking Dąbrowski's Theory about level 2. Well, there's one for level 1 and for level 2. But in the level 2 one, he gives examples of people who just ended up questioning authority because people who were like authority figures in their lives suddenly did something to disappoint them, or suddenly they realized that they were being told something that wasn't true. For people who are going through multi-level disintegration, it's really critical to develop a program of change based on their own values. So this, in Dąbrowskian terms, would be called a program of auto-psychotherapy and self-education, which is very individual. Those of us who've been through it can certainly offer strategies from our own lives. But again, it's up to each person to find what works for them and to create their own path. It is a self-created process of change.
It's got to be self-created because you're the only one who can define what you believe, what's important to you. So then what are your values? You're the only one who can truly say who you are authentically inside. So it is a little bit reliant on you to have a think, be self-aware about how you're behaving, think about what's important to you, think about what you really value, and then look at your behavior and say, am I walking my talk? And if I'm not, what can I do to change that, to make sure that I am behaving in a way that aligns with my values? But I guess relationships are very important in the theory. When we talk about values and behavior, a lot of things like empathy and kindness and that, it's all how we relate to other people. So you don't have to do it alone, even though your path will be unique to you. Find community, find a guide. Having the tool of the theory is enormously important. But I guess recognize that it is a very long and sometimes continuing cyclic process. You know, things will happen to you through your life that might make you stop and rethink a few things. So self-compassion is also really important. And I saw someone put in the chat that they didn't realize that they ever had a sharpener. And I guess that's that feeling of feeling like you're broken. And part of this whole thing with the theory and why we both love it is because it's non-pathologizing and tells us, look, these big uncomfortable emotions, they have a purpose. We are not broken. And once we understand that about ourselves, we can start to forgive ourselves for some of the things that have happened to us in the past and are happening to us now.
Yes, to all of that. The only other thing I wanted to say really about this, you mentioned that it's a long process. I mean, you can see here that it's a long ass process, but I just want to mention that the heart of this theory is inner transformation. It's what the dynamisms are all about, helping you shape yourself into who you're meant to be, who you want to be, who you see yourself being. One of the beautiful things about positive disintegration is that it can be a creative process of self-development based on your values. We talk so much about creativity, creating things outside of ourselves, but our process of transforming ourselves can also be beautiful and creative. And that's what we're going to talk about now from our own experiences. So Emma made these timelines for us of our journeys, and I'm going to go first. So I'm going to share my story and attempt to connect some of the things that we've been talking about today with my lived experience. For context, I'm 50 years old, almost 51. I grew up in Connecticut here in the United States. I was identified as a gifted kid, but I always felt very different from everyone else. And it turned out that I had multiple kinds of neurodivergence, which is something that I didn't really figure out until middle age. And I think I'm still figuring out all the aspects of myself, but I've included some of my major disintegrations in this graphic. The first one that I noted is the first one that I clearly remember. My early childhood memories are not really accessible to me. My earliest memories are like 4 or 5 years old. But this first little volcano with the no imaginal world, that happened when I was 7 and kind of almost 8. I developed an imaginal world at that time in my mind. I have a really strong imagination. And I experienced it as a parallel existence to the one that I was living in this concrete reality. Well, in that imaginal space that I was living in, I imagined myself dying. My first experience of kind of seeing outside of myself was watching myself trying to die by suicide from a variety of ways. And that kicked off a long period of a fascination with suicide and death, and also drugs. It's interesting when I think about gifted kids and their passions, it's kind of sad to me to realize that kind of my special interest when I was young was drugs and death. Well, 2 of them. Those were my 2 special interests as a kid. And of course, I had other things that I was interested in, but in my mind, I was constantly thinking about these things. The next disintegration for me was, in middle school, which I actually didn't include on here. I had other little disintegrations when I was young until high school. I had what I would consider really the first growthful one, where there was a huge amount of growth from an experience that to me was very painful. I loved the school I was in. It was very hard for me to get kicked out, but getting kicked out led me to discover that I didn't want to be somebody who was like a vandal or malicious. Like the things that I did to get me kicked out of school helped me realize how guilty I felt about the people that had been harmed, and the things that I was doing that got me kicked out of school. And I felt like that was a really important part of my path. I've shared quite a lot on Substack lately about the huge disintegration I had when I was 20, 21, which I labeled here with multiple traumas. In episode 8 of the podcast, as well as in some of our written posts, I've discussed the different traumas that I've experienced. During that time, I felt like I completely fell apart. I mean, that at the time, it felt like a nervous breakdown. I just completely fell apart. It was years of unilevel disintegration with bits of multi-level. So an interesting thing in my story, I think, is that in high school, I had a disintegration that had very clear multi-level elements. And at times, looked really positive. Later, I had a disintegration that was more unilevel, that completely broke me down. And I was hospitalized 10 times between the ages of 21 and 25 for mental illness. I was diagnosed with a variety of diagnoses by numerous clinicians. I have seen like 45 different clinicians over my lifetime. And I was diagnosed with, depression, depersonalization disorder, bipolar disorder, panic disorder, ADHD, borderline personality disorder, many diagnoses, lots of mental health experiences. There were also periods of drug addiction in that time. I was chronically suicidal for years. I was on disability for mental illness for more than a decade until I finally managed to turn my life around. And actually, on here, that's the first multi-level shift. When I was 26, I experienced what I would call a moment of sudden dynamic insight. I saw in my mind that I didn't have to go to drugs anymore. I wasn't going to be a mental patient anymore. I realized in that moment that that wasn't my path, that I could change myself. And I did. I mean, that was a first shift forward. There was more trauma ahead of me, though. And so here, the trauma volcano, when I was 36, went through another period of disintegration, again, saw some unilevel elements to it. But I found that, I would say, with age and experience and auto-psychotherapy through writing and meditation, other things that I do, the periods of disintegration in my life kind of shortened and became more manageable. Finally, at 41, I was a doctoral student at the time. I discovered a research method called autoethnography. And that became, for me, the most powerful program of auto-psychotherapy and self-education in my life. And that was when I discovered the theory of positive disintegration. This led to, I would say, the most dramatic multi-level shift I experienced. During that time, I was exploring my past, trying to understand how could I have been such a seemingly hopeless mental patient for so long and not be able to find a path forward until I finally did. Like, I was just trying to understand what had happened to me. I was looking at myself as being somebody with giftedness and mental illness. Like, how did they coexist? That's when I discovered the term twice exceptional. That was a huge deal for me. Obviously, I mean, it brought me here to you, like, talking about this now. Honestly, it's so hard for us to talk briefly about this, but this was my experience. I was a mental patient. The Menninger Clinic questioned at one point if I was even treatable. That's the kind of person I was when I was in my 20s, addicted to drugs, on multiple medications. Now I haven't been to a psychiatrist since 2017. I learned how to create my own path and to find the tools that worked for me, to let the dynamisms shape me, to take control of them. And I love the opportunity now to bring the theory of positive disintegration to other people. And I am going to hand things over to Emma so she can tell you about her history.
Thanks. And I'm going to reiterate something in the chat, and it never ceases. Anytime I hear your stories, it's very powerful to see the difference that doing the work's made in your life. And I'm so glad it has, because otherwise we wouldn't be friends. And I love hearing your story of progress and triumph, really. So my story, I guess in some ways it's very different. Obviously, we're two different people, but I guess I want to highlight, you can see I've got a big one at the end, a big disintegration. And the similarity I want to draw out is the difference finding the theory made in making sense of myself. So, I wasn't identified as gifted, but everybody knew I was a very smart child. That much was clear. But I was also very overexcitable. But my emotions and my overexcitability, nobody knew the term for that. It was just seen as bad behavior. So every time I fidgeted or daydreamed or let out a burst of emotion, I was being naughty. On the one hand, my intelligence or my academic achievement was a good thing and I was praised for it, but all the other emotions and stuff that went with it were never any good. And I sort of lived along with this until I was about 7. And that's when my parents got divorced and everything started to fall apart. I couldn't grieve really. I got the whole be a good girl for your mother. She's going through a very hard time, but no one seemed to recognize I was going through a tremendously hard time as well. Back in the early 80s, kids were just sort of expected to get along with their life when these things happened. But I was falling apart inside. I was questioning the fairness. Why is this happening to me? Wondering whether or not I was broken and there was something wrong with me that caused my parents to not love me enough to want to stay together. I was angry at the fact that I couldn't grieve. And so I was going through all this stuff and, it was very Unilevel because, hey, I was 7. I wasn't able to figure this stuff out on my own, but it came out in all these somatic consequences. So I got pneumonia. I had chronic bronchitis for many years. I was always a sickly kid after that. And I had to sort of adjust through that very prickly period with the cactuses that you can see in my life. I then had a second disintegration when I was about 11, just before I started high school, and it was actually a good one. I started to question my largely Christian upbringing and started to wonder or not whether or not there was a God. And so I went through my first real process of actually sitting down and questioning myself and figuring out what was important to me. When I was in high school, I thrived there, really. So, even though things were a bit prickly at first, my teen years were largely okay. But I got into my first serious relationship at the age of 17. And while it started out okay, we were young and in love, it started to go downhill after a while. So you can see the cactuses popping up again. The relationship started to become abusive. And this is where I got stuck for a very long period of time in negative disintegration. And that little volcano in the background should probably be 3 times the size, to be honest. I had a lot of unilevel and multi-level dynamisms. I couldn't resolve them. I was blaming myself for everything that was going wrong. I was doubting myself. I didn't know who I was. And I didn't handle it very well. I made a couple of suicide attempts and I used a hell of a lot of drugs to try and cope with what was going on, not only in my life externally, but what was going on inside my own head about myself. The abuse got worse. So did the dynamisms. My brain was trying to tell me I wasn't living my life in a way that was really me. I wasn't being me, and life was just in the toilet for a very long, protracted time. Again, I thought it was because I was broken. I thought it was all my fault. I couldn't have healthy relationships because I was broken and there was something wrong with me. But eventually I left and I went through a period of positive disintegration. I actually, I started with a whole heap of debt, a couple of bags of clothes. I was living in my dad's caravan. I had no money. And I had to sit down and figure out what was important to me and actually had to put some thought into my values because I really didn't want to get into another bad relationship. So I'm like, I have to figure out what I really want in life and what I really want, in a potential partner, because otherwise I'm just going to go into another horrible negative spiral. So I started over, and for a long time, life was good. And it seemed all great on the outside. I found a new loving partner and things were rosy, but there was still something inside of me that just still didn't feel like it fit in. I still felt broken in a way because as I progressed through middle age, I wasn't comfortable in the cookie cutter white picket fence dream. There was something missing and something not right. And I still felt like an awkward fit in life. I still felt markedly different and wasn't understanding why. But then the big one came about 4 years ago. And in Australia, we had some really huge bushfires at the end of 2019, and there was absolutely nothing to do, couldn't leave the house. So I tried creative writing for the first time in my life, and it unraveled everything inside me. I was reaching into my authentic voice for the first time unconsciously, and all this stuff just came spewing out on the page. And I felt like my head was falling apart. So I did what we do in this day and age. I went to the internet for answers. And I typed in something to Google like, why is my brain falling apart? And I just accidentally stumbled across the theory of positive disintegration and overexcitabilities. And it hit me like a bolt of lightning. Here I was looking at the computer screen like the ugly duckling in the fairy tale looks at his reflection in the water. And for the very first time in my life, I was seeing myself and understanding that I wasn't broken. I read the term neurodivergent for the first time. I rediscovered the term giftedness. And I found this theory that explained the things that had been happening to me through my entire life. And since that moment, I've been using that tool to make sense, make sense of myself, make sense of my past, and slowly come to the understanding that I really am not broken and that all the turmoil and the struggle and the self-doubt and everything that I've been through had been my brain's way of prompting me to make change and to transform within myself. And this is exactly why I then got onto YouTube, because I thought, I have this tool. It helped me so much. It's helped me understand all my dark days. It's helped me understand myself. I really have to share it with others. And then one thing led to another. And next thing I know, I'm doing a podcast with Chris. But in the meantime, it has been that long ass process of discovery. I've been, on the path ever since. But I can tell you, my inner life has seriously, seriously turned around. Now that I have that compass to navigate life, it is a markedly different experience than any other disintegrations that came before it.
Thanks so much, Emma. Oh my gosh, I love hearing your story too. And it just prompted me to think of a couple things just to follow up on what I said. That feeling like there was something wrong with me was with me my whole life until maybe like the past 10 years. What's wrong with me? I was always looking for that. What's wrong with me? Like, where are the answers? Discovering this theory and finding out that it's not something wrong with you is just incredibly powerful and transformative. And I just wanted to mention that, like, I don't have that imaginal world like process anymore. Part of my recent disintegrations during this past 10 years completely dismantled that particular imaginal process in my mind. Somehow I integrated it. And now I am just living in this one reality as one person instead of having this other experience of me in my mind. And it's amazing to me, like, how different my life is now that I am just living as me. And I would just say the only other thing that came to me that I would want to mention in this session is that gender was a part of my recent disintegration process, again, over this past 10 years when I discovered autoethnography. But when I was a kid, the term non-binary, like the idea of gender diversity, didn't exist. There was no option but to be a boy or a girl. And I never felt like I fit in that binary. I grew up not feeling like other girls, wondering what was wrong with me, but also not feeling like a boy, And so I never had any language to understand that about myself. And then at some point, and I don't know when the first time I discovered the term non-binary, but when I did, I was like, oh, that's me. That's me. Like, that's the word that makes sense of this thing that I've always experienced. And to finally not feel like I was a broken woman, but to have some other way of understanding myself, it was amazing. But that was another whole thing I had to go through. I'm married to a man. I have a child that I gave birth to. It was like a whole process of having to, reconcile these things about myself, come to some self-acceptance around this. It took lots of self-compassion. But wow, like on the other side of all of that, I finally feel like I am my authentic self in every setting and situation. And it's amazing to be able to live that way. It's really powerful.
I think it's a combination of having the tools and realizing that you are not broken, but also understanding that the path out of this isn't moving away from yourself. It's about moving towards yourself, because every other process that I'd had prior to this, I tried to be less like me. And I know that there's a lot of gifted and neurodivergent people out there who will resonate with this when I say you spend a lot of your life thinking that being happy is being normal, right? So what you do is you try and fit. You try to be the round peg in the round hole. You try and fit into the cookie cutter mold because you think that's where happiness lies. You think that's where you're going to find your peace. And you keep trying to cram yourself into a box where you don't fit and then wondering why you're never going to be happy. But as soon as you turn around your thinking of that and go, you know what? Hey, it's not me that's broken. Like, stop trying to fix yourself because you are not broken and start to try and be more like you and not more normal. That's really the key, I think. So if you're beating your head against a brick wall out there and trying to think that you're going to be happy by being normal, no, you'll be happier by being more like you.
Even if it's difficult at first, you will, because you have to go through that whole process of learning to disappoint people, because being yourself often means that you're not pleasing other people anymore. And so there's kind of an awkward time there that's uncomfortable. But once you get through it, it's the only way. This is the way. You can find us on the podcast or on Substack. Emma has her YouTube channel, Adults with Overexcitabilities, the Tragic Gift blog, Dąbrowski Center. We're like all over the place at this point. That's pretty funny to say it all. Any last words from you?
No, I think that's it. And just thanks for everybody for joining us.
Yes, that's right. Definitely. Thank you for joining us. And thanks, Mike and Julie, for inviting us to be a part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Continue your path to authenticity through the links in the show notes. Subscribe to our Substack newsletter for stacks of cool things delivered straight to your inbox. Explore the Dąbrowski Center, email us, or join us on social media. And don't forget to show your love by liking, subscribing, grabbing some positive Disintegration merch, or leaving us a rating or review on your podcast platform.